Today we're featuring another user-requested look at the Justice League villain known as Amazo. I also tend to do a bonus look at figures I made a few years ago, and I chose Mercy since she had a large supporting role in Amazo's debut episode Tabula Rasa. Since Amazo was started previously, we'll look at his recipe and do a catch-up to the point where I began filming his progress. Due to the larger size of Ivo's android, I knew I was going to need a much bigger figure as a base. I originally looked at using some of the 10-inch Justice League figures that Mattel made during the show's original run, but they seemed like they might be a little too big. McFarlane had recently released their first few animated figures, and those drew my eye as an option. They had a weird aesthetic to them, but I thought that using a body that was a little too small would be less noticeable than using one that was too big. Plus, I already have enough trouble fitting on my shelves everything that I'm planning to make, so a bigger guy would only take up more room. With the base body settled, I started looking for a suitable replacement head. Looking for a character that DCC made before with a slim, longer head could really only be one option: TNBA Bane. He even has the triangular eyes with little dots in them that matched Amazo's look. Given that I never know if I'll need to keep an original head for a different recipe, I turned to casting a copy of Bane's head. If you're unfamiliar with the process, check out the link above and see how user-friendly it can be. With the body and head all picked out and copied, it was time to start modifying the body and see if I could turn the odd McFarlane sculpt into a more recognizable DCAU silhouette. I began by trying to fix those weird shoulder caps they made. They were way too bulbous for a Bruce Timm design and really needed to be flattened out and pressed down. Next, I needed to tackle all those different seam lines they added on John. For that, I turned to my Testors Contour Molding Putty. This stuff works like magic and will fill any small crevices and cure in about an hour, to a level that can be sanded or dremeled even. There's a ton of sanding to do on this guy, but I spared you the time and only filmed 2 clips of it. Once you're good with how smooth he is after the dremeling and puttying, we can move on to sculpting. As mentioned in the previous section, I needed to think about how I would modify the sculpt on this guy to match his DCAU counterpart better. I sculpted a couple layers onto his chest to look right, which included making it wider near the arms and then straight across on the bottom. I also ended up adding to his biceps more to blend better with his shoulders. That's the key word when making any of these kinds of additions: blending. You always want to make sure you smear the epoxy enough that you only have to sand a little bit for it to properly blend in with the existing figure. The other bit of sculpting needed was to make Bane's head look more like Amazo's. A little dremeling here, a little epoxy there, and you're left with a nice smooth shape with only those piercing eyes left over. I didn't necessarily want to just have a primed gray buck body in my collection, and I love the drama of the end fight in part 1, so I decided I wanted to make Amazo look like he did after absorbing the League's powers. That meant keeping Green Lantern's bracers for Wonder Woman's, his power ring, and then adding the Superman diamond and eventually Hawkgirl's mace and wings. I have yet to make the mace, but it will be a nearly identical process to my previous maces. I used an 80s TMNT accessory for the ball of the mace and made a piece from one of the stands that all DCC figures originally came with. Then added some epoxy at the hilt as well as a piece of price tag plastic for the loop handle. The last part can be tricky to successfully glue on, but you can do it with a few attempts. My idea for the wings is to 3D print them using a model I found online, but I have yet to delve into the 3D printing world, so that will need to wait. With all the body modifications done, we can move on to the final step: painting. Amazo will only need 2 shades of gray, a tiny bit of black, and even less red for his eyes. Luckily, the gray primer I use is basically the perfect shade for his base body, so a good chunk of his painting can be done with a few simple sprayed-on coats. As I've mentioned before, cell shading can be fairly freeform, but you'll want to follow the same basic shapes to get the right look and feel of the character. I've chosen to light the one side of him, so I'm painting on the highlights mainly onto his right side. For the head, paint the triangles around his eyes black, and then pick out his eyes with 2 dots of red. Oh, I forgot a paint color. I used my trusty UV green to give his Green Lantern ring a nice glow under black light. Pop the head back on and he's all set. Stay tuned for a future video where Amazo will make his triumphant return, this time in gold. Oh wait, I almost forgot, we're looking at Mercy Graves today too. As I mentioned before, she was a bit of a natural choice and she's featured in this episode and has a similar color scheme. However, I did decide to go with her original Superman the Animated Series look, as to me that is her more iconic design. For Mercy's recipe, I noticed that Roxy Rocket had a very similar build and design, and her face looks a lot like a determined Lois Lane's face. Those two combined meant I only needed to add a hat, skirt, and jacket flap before giving her a repaint. Unfortunately, I only took a few photos at the time, so you don't get much of a look at her actual process. I did experiment with the idea of using green stuff for her skirt, but I must have done something wrong because the mix turned out very uneven and chunky. I then turned to an odd choice, but I used a plastic figure bubble package and sculpted on top of that. These days I would have simply used rubber and then blended it in with epoxy onto the torso. That would make a much more even look if you decide to make her. After you've dremeled off any unnecessary parts and sculpted on what you need, you can finish her up with some paint. I use these few paints in layered, thin coats. Lastly, paint Lois's purple eyes so she looks less recognizable, and you're all done. Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed looking at these two slate-colored sculpts and hope you make your own attempts while following along. Speaking of following, follow me on Instagram where you can see a lot more characters I've made from all throughout the DCAU as well as some cool shots of them. Join me next time for our first full Batman Beyond double feature, ink and a brief bonus overview of Derek Powers. Drop a comment down below if you want to see a making of video for a specific character chosen from my Instagram gallery, or let me know if you make any of your own customs. I'd love to see them. And feel free to like and subscribe to get notified for my next video. Have a good one, and happy customizing.